one of my colleagues posted on Facebook. She said that she was trying to find a good title for her stewardship sermon. After several hours of fruitless effort, all she could come up with was this: "It's Stewardship Sunday. Come anyway." About the same time, one of our members sent me a list of mistakes from Sunday bulletins. Most of them were sermon titles, and one of them was this: "The associate minister is upping his pledge. Up yours." I, of course, immediately sent that one to my strapped colleague. At that point, I had noticed that her Facebook post had become something like a war of stewardship jokes. So, for no particular reason relating to this sermon or anything else, here's a few more. The Sunday school teacher was just finishing a lesson on honesty. "Do you know where little boys go if they don't put their money in the collection plate?" the teacher asked. "Yes, ma'am," a boy blurted out. "They go to the movies." And here's one more. This one might be my favorite. "The strong man at the circus sideshow demonstrated his power before a large audience. Toward the end, he squeezed the juice of a lemon between his hands. And then he said to the audience, 'I will offer $200 to anyone in the audience who can squeeze another drop from this lemon.' A thin, scholarly-looking woman came forward, picked up the lemon, strained hard, and she managed to get a drop. The strong man was amazed. He paid the woman and asked, 'What is the secret of your strength?' 'Practice,' the woman answered. 'I was the treasurer of the East Side Unitarian Church for 32 years. Thank you. Okay, so enough with all this seriousness. Let's get down to the sermon. I'm thinking today about how we approach money, and specifically about the stories that we tell ourselves and one another. How do those stories influence patterns of giving, both in our own lives and more broadly? And don't worry, I do have a few more jokes in store. The first set of narratives that influence the way that we deal with money are family narratives. They're personal narratives. It is a dimension that gets insufficient attention in our culture, I think. We see self-help books that tell us how to create a reasonable budget, or, more grandly, scheme our way into millions. But not many of them touch upon the reservoir of personal history around money. When I was in seminary, we were once asked to create a family tree and outline the relationship each person on the tree had with money. Many of us, used to talking about personal issues in sermons and in theological reflections at that point, found this family history of money quite uncomfortable. I was one of them. While my parents are Unitarian Universalists, they both came from German Catholic families. The message that those families had passed on is that a lot of things, including money, is that we don't talk about it. Privacy is paramount. And because of this, money became something like a mystery in my family. Sometimes it would seem that we had it and we would go on an exciting vacation or buy something new. And at other times, it was like it just disappeared and left us, and we were barely scraping by. Either way, it was never talked about. At the end of the exercise in seminary, we were asked to capture our family's experience with money in a single metaphor. I came up with this. Money was a mysterious uncle in my family. Sometimes he showed up bearing gifts, and sometimes he'd be gone for months or years. No one could ask too many questions. My colleagues had equally intriguing metaphors for money in their families. For one, it was the family secret, and her metaphor came from the telltale heart, a body buried beneath the floorboards. For another colleague whose family used money to manipulate each other, his metaphor was an emotionally abusive partner. And for a friend whose family had very few issues around money, where it was talked about in a realistic way, his metaphor was a house. It needed to be maintained, but it also provided shelter. It was a great exercise, and it is one that I recommend that anyone undertake. What it does is it helps us to begin to create some distance from our histories so that we can have some agency over the stories that we're telling ourselves. Rather than letting the mysterious uncle or the body under the floorboards or the emotionally abusive partner own us, we can start to take control and make decisions about it. But until we do that, the prevailing family metaphor will control us more than we control it. Second, the stories of individual congregations influence the way that churches handle money. One congregation that I was a part of had a leaky spot in a part of its roof. No one could talk about it. Apparently, some fight related to financing the repair had broken out years ago, and the congregation had decided just not to speak of it anymore. The work of the minister in that congregation, as he understood it, was to gently begin that conversation. Yet another New England congregation that I know of, and this is probably by far the most interesting one, had taken a box of financial records and hid them. Legend had it that they were buried somewhere on the church property, perhaps in a metal box under the earth somewhere. The point of it was to hide where certain sources of funding had come from. There was a constant threat in the congregation anytime money was brought up that someone would produce this box of financial records and it would wreck the congregation. Not surprisingly, members complained constantly of distrust. An unhealthy practice around money had contaminated the congregational well. The last I heard, congregational consultants were helping that congregation search for its lost records, if they even existed, and deal with that reality. The point is that the stories we tell ourselves about money have enormous sway over our lives. Now, I actually think that our church has a pretty healthy history and practice around money. Yet, I wonder how we might model that healthy practice as we're thinking about stewardship this year in terms of our institutional surroundings and how we regard ourselves. One of the things that congregational consultants look for is a congregation's self-esteem. The way they measure self-esteem in a congregation is by looking at how it cares for its buildings and grounds. You might think of it this way. If you were going to have your wedding here, how would you want the grounds to look? What about the buildings? I think we might have a little bit of work to do. Now, Jocelyn Combs is doing some excellent work to try to get the grounds in order, and Pat Thorne is doing some great work on one of the rooms. I encourage you to get involved and to help us make our space beautiful and something to be proud of, and to help make sure that we have enough money in our budget to adequately care for our space as we are completing the stewardship process this year. So I have named lots of stories and metaphors today that influence the way that we think about money. How should we frame them? How should we think about them? How should we choose certain stories and let go of others that might not be so helpful? I like the story that comes from the Taoist tradition of the carpenter and the tree. To me, that parable is saying we should be careful of the stories that we tell and ask whether they are actually useful and helpful to us. Rather than being owned by our stories around money, we can ask about what good those stories are doing in our lives. If they are unhelpful, perhaps it's time to find a different story. Another way to look at it is that our stories are only useful if they are making room for something else, for something grander and more valuable. The ancient Taoist sage Lao Tzu put it this way: shape clay into a vessel, it is the space within that makes it useful. Cut doors and windows from a room, it is the holes that make those useful. Therefore, work for what is there only in order to hold what is not there. In other words, are the stories that we tell about money creating a space that can hold justice and love and more ways to authentically be in community with each other? What do we realistically need to do in order to fund those things in our community and to be a force for good in the world? What do we realistically need to fund in order to have a beautiful church campus that we are proud of? It is a question of looking at funding as a container for something more beautiful and worthy. I ask that each of us consider these questions as we complete the stewardship process this year, and please do set aside some time to meet with your canvasser if you have not already done so. And if none of that is convincing to you, then think of giving as life insurance. Here's what I mean. 2 men were marooned on an island. One man paced back and forth, worried and scared, while the other man sat back sunning himself. The first man said to the second man, "Aren't you afraid that we're going to die?" "No," said the second man. "I make a $100,000 a week pledge to my church. My pastor will find me." I love you, and blessings on your journey.